So it's well known that immigrants from Latin America comprise the majority of the foreign-born population in the United States, and that many face barriers to their social mobility rooted in their humble socioeconomic origins, limited English-speaking ability, and blocked pathway to citizenship. That as immigrants that preceded them, civic engagement or involvement in communal activities that extend beyond self-interest has the potential to increase opportunities for Latino immigrant families and their communities. My work on Latino immigrant civic engagement shines a spotlight on LA County. And I'm sure most of you know that LA has the highest numeric concentration of Latino immigrants in the country. And it also educates 1 in 11 Latino public school children in the country. So while LA is a lot larger than the Bay Area, the findings that I'm going to present here apply to Oakland and Berkeley and the larger Bay Area in various ways. So here are some quick statistics for those who are less familiar with the demographics of Los Angeles. So there are about 10 million people in LA County, and Latinos comprise 45% of them. Most of the Latinos are first and second generation immigrants. And to give you some perspective, there are about 3 times more Latinos in LA County than there are people in Alameda County. Okay. So there are definitely more Latino immigrants than there are people in Alameda County. So while most Latino adults are immigrants in LA, most of the children are born in the US. Here's just a quick graph on the growth of the Latino student population in Los Angeles. So almost 2/3 of Latino students in LA County, or almost 2/3 of students in LA County are Latino. Another little factoid. We've got a pretty severe educational crisis in LA. And Latino students aren't doing well in LA, and they're not necessarily doing well here as well. But here's, just so you have a sense of how tough things are, for every 100 students that entered 9th grade in 2005, 2006, 54 graduated 4 years later. Okay, graduated on time. Some people graduated in the summer. And then only 17 graduated college ready, meaning they completed the A through G requirements to go to a 4-year university. Okay, so this provides some context for parent civic engagement. And I don't want to suggest in any way that these low graduation rates and college readiness rates are because parents are not involved. I don't want to suggest that. As the research in education has shown us, some of the key correlates of the Latino academic failure have to do with poverty, to some extent unequal school conditions. In Los Angeles County, schools that educate majority Latino students tend to have disproportionately overcrowded conditions. Classrooms are overcrowded, schools have been historically overcrowded, there's too many unqualified teachers, and there's a lack of rigorous curriculum. However, in the last decade or so, we've seen some pretty significant reforms in LA, and some of these significant reforms have been backed by parents. So there's been a new school construction initiative in LA. LA has built, I think, 100 new schools or something like that. A lot of new schools within the last decade, and parents were protesting they were asking for these new schools. There were also policies to increase the college prep or A through G curriculum, and parents and youth were critical in pushing for this major reform. So, understanding school-based civic engagement is important for various reasons. First, it can help address the crisis in Latino educational achievement. I don't want to suggest that parent engagement, parent involvement is the main solution. It's part of a broader solution. Another important reason to study civic engagement in schools is because there's no legal documentation requirements for school participation. So, studying voting patterns is important, but a significant proportion of the population can't vote. But everybody legally has the right to be involved in their children's schools, if they're parents. And then another important reason to study civic engagement in schools is that schools are plentiful in immigrant communities. And as other research has shown us, community-based organizations and other organizations that engage immigrants are not as plentiful, with the exception of perhaps churches. So, the civic engagement literature has told us that socioeconomic status, immigrant background characteristics tend to be predictors, sometimes, not always, predictors of civic engagement. And I'm happy to talk about these typical predictors of civic engagement as they relate to schools in the Q&A, because I've done a broader study on Latino immigrant civic engagement in schools. It's not about union members, and I can talk about these things. But what I'm going to focus on is organizational membership. The research has shown us, or has hypothesized, that being a member of an organization tends to develop people's civic capacity for collective action in civic and political settings. What I'm doing is that I'm questioning how and to what extent organizational membership shapes the civic engagement of Latino immigrants. And I look at these two organizations, but as you know, I'm focusing on labor unions today. So in Los Angeles, only about 10% of Latino immigrant workers are represented by a union. This is a pretty low percentage. Countywide, the union density rate is about 15%. However, labor unions remain one of the organizations that involve significant numbers of Latino immigrants. And the labor unions with many immigrants tend to be the most radical, the most active, the most visible. As Kim knows, SCIU and Unite HERE are really powerful, very visible labor unions in Los Angeles. So what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time is how and to what extent being a member of a labor union shapes school-based civic participation. And I'm looking at membership as well as labor union participation and how that affects or correlates with union members' civic engagement in their children's schools. So a lot of the research on labor unions has kind of looked at union membership as a dummy variable. And some of the research has found that if you're a member of a labor union, you're more likely to vote than the average person. There's also work that shows that labor unions engage their members in a range of non-workplace campaigns and civic efforts, such as the immigrant rights movement, campaigns for living wages. In some cases, unions have involved their members in transnational politics and a range of different civic and political activities. But what I'm interested in is how labor union participation impacts people's civic engagement outside of non-union sponsored efforts. So we know very little about that. To what extent do people take what they learn in their labor union, going to protest, going door to door on the political campaign, filing a grievance, standing up to their boss? To what extent do they take that outside of the union and apply it in their everyday lives? When thinking about school-based civic engagement, I make a conceptual distinction between two types of civic engagement. And I borrow from my colleague at USC, Paul Lichterman, who coined this term plug-in involvement. And plug-in involvement tends to be the type of civic engagement or volunteer activity where a participant can take direction from a professional, from a school personnel, and kind of be told what to do. Plug-in involvement is important because it gets things done in a community. In the case of schools, parents who go to events or PTA meetings or volunteer help with school programming. They get to know each other. Plug-in involvement is good. But it doesn't necessarily require people to speak up or voice their interests or challenge an authority figure such as the school principal. Whereas critical engagement is a type of involvement that requires people to speak up, speak on their own interests, challenge authority, and so forth. And within the context of schools, there are decision-making bodies such as the school site council or English language advisory committee and other school decision-making bodies that tend to be spaces where parents have the potential to be critically engaged. I don't want to suggest that whenever there's a school site council meeting or a school English language committee, parents are always voicing their interests and concerns. In some cases, decision-making bodies tend to be like PTA meetings. However, school site councils and so forth have the potential, or they create the space where parents may demand things and affect school policy and so forth. Another form of critical engagement is participation in school improvement efforts, whether they might be participating in a district-wide effort for new schools, or school improvement efforts can be initiated by parents themselves or involve teachers and parents and so forth. But these are efforts to change school policies or challenge something that is not quite right at a school site. So my main argument is that labor union participation or labor union membership does not uniformly impact member civic engagement. First of all, distinctions must be made between different forms of civic engagement. So there's a plug-in type of involvement and more critical forms of engagement. Distinctions must be made between active and inactive union members. So what I'm going to argue is that active members acquire certain civic skills that inactive members do not have access to. And then I'm going to show how individuals without prior civic experience learn different, to some extent, learn different things and acquire different set of skills than those who are already predisposed to civic participation. And people who have more civic experience tend to more quickly acquire certain leadership skills. So, my research, what I'm going to present here focuses on the United Service Workers West, formerly known as SEIU Local 1877, the janitors union, which had historic wins in the early 90s, through the 90s and the 2000s, and are really known for the social movement unionism that Kim writes about, where significant proportions of workers are engaged in campaigns, not only at their local work site, but across, in this case, the city and even the county of Los Angeles. And campaigns, the SEIU Justice for Janitors campaigns have taken place not only in Los Angeles, but here in the Bay Area, in different states, and so forth. So some of the tactics that union members in LA learn, members across the country, union members across the country also learn. So here's a picture I took on Figueroa of a march. This was in 2008. This union member likes to carry a mop to the protest because Archbishop Mahoney at the time blessed it. So she's very, very proud of her mop.
Just make it a little crowd.
Huh?
Yeah. Do a cross.
Yeah. So if she goes to a protest, you often see them up. Okay. So to give you a little bit of context. In Los Angeles, we have janitor neighborhoods. I took the union's memberships list and mapped out where the members live. And dark areas of this map of LA County represent areas where there's a high concentration of union members. This is important for a couple of reasons. Oh, that's where I work. So a lot of the union members live in communities that are predominantly Latino and African American. So the dark areas of this map are neighborhoods that are 80 to 100% Latino or African American. So it gives you a sense of the high levels of school segregation in LA. And schools with very high concentrations of Latino and African American students tend to be disproportionately disadvantaged in the sense that they're overcrowded, have all these school problems, not enough teachers or too many of their teachers getting laid off and so forth. So these under-resourced schools provide the context for parents' civic engagement. This is also important. This map is also important because it speaks to the potential of union members to be mobilized not only as workers at their work site, but parents of children who attend the same school. So in a different map that I'm not going to bore you with, I mapped out the catchment areas of the schools, and I found out that 700 union members live around LA High School. The organizing potential of mobilizing the workers as parents is pretty high. And I'll explain to you why. Okay. So I'm drawing on several data sources. In 2007, I conducted a random sample of SCIU members with children. I got a survey sample size of 378 with a 69% response rate. That's what I could do as a grad student. And then I did 40 follow-up in-depth interviews, and then I've also did a 2.5 years of participant observation with the labor union. I interviewed staff and other union members. I also, more recently, in 2010, along with John Rogers, conducted a survey of 505 randomly selected parents in LA, plus another comparison sample of 135 parents from other labor unions, and I'm happy to talk about this part of the research later on. And I've done an interviews with a comparison sample of 100 parents. Some of those were labor union members. 30 of those 100 were immigrant Latino non-union parents. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about these 30 non-union parents. Here's some quick statistics, descriptive statistics of my sample. 58% were female, about 3/4 don't have a high school degree. This got messed up. 8% were born in the USA.
That's the fault of our very old Mac.
The PC to Mac. The PC to Mac.
I think it's more that thing's a relic.
Okay.
Our fault.
And so what I did first in my analysis was do a simple logistic regression, trying to examine the relationship between labor union participation and plug-in and civic engagement in schools and critical engagement in schools. And the first set of analysis, I just compared active union members to inactive union members. And I controlled for things we know matter: gender, parent education, or we think matter: gender, parent education, citizenship, English proficiency, and child's grade level. Here's some more descriptive statistics. There's high participation in most plug-in forms of involvement except volunteering, and just about a third of the just under a third of the sample was involved in critical forms of civic engagement. And in 2008, when I conducted the survey, or 2007, 29% of the study participants had reported attending a union action or rally within the past year, had reported participating in precinct walking or in phone banking. So these are measures of union participation that are somewhat typical of social movement unionism. So one thing I have to explain here. So we see that only 29% of union members participated in their union within the last year. And there's a key logistical reason for this. So SCIU, the United Service Workers West, represents 8,000 workers that work in buildings that are scattered all over LA County. And because of limited resources and time and effort, the union tends to concentrate its outreach efforts in the large buildings that employ a lot of workers. So the union organizer tends to go to buildings in downtown LA and in Century City, and they tend to visit the workers at night because most of the janitors work at night. For the most part, workers who work in tiny buildings get neglected. They rarely, if ever, see a union representative. The most contact they have from their union is a robocall, saying, letting them know about some event, or they get mail, things in the mail. So what I looked at correlates of union participation, and I found that nighttime workers are 2.85 times more likely than daytime workers to participate in union activities. And I wish I could have tested and controlled for whether people worked in large buildings or small buildings, but I didn't have that data. So here are the results of the logistic regression that I did, looking at predicted probabilities of participating in plug-in types of school involvement. And initially when I did this study, I thought that the active union members were going to be involved in everything. But I didn't find that. I found that union participants and non-participants were about as equally as likely to go to a school event, go to a PTA meeting, or volunteer. So that was somewhat unexpected. But then I found out that people who participated in their union were significantly more likely to go to a school decision-making meeting or to participate in some school improvement effort. And I wanted to see if there were differences between the union members and this random sample of parents that I surveyed. And what I found was that inactive union members were about as likely as non-union members to participate in decision-making or school improvement efforts. But active union members were significantly more likely than the random sample of non-union parents to participate in decision-making meetings or in school improvement efforts. And I controlled for the other union members who ended up in my random sample and got some really large coefficients, but the sample was fine. I could talk about these folks later on.
Could you go back to the table?
Sure. So what I showed here is a correlation between being an active union member and participating in critical forms of school involvement. And there may be some alternative explanations to this finding. One might be that individuals self-select to participate in their unions in schools. You might be a particularly motivated person who likes to complain, likes to participate in everything. My mom says I'm one of those people. Or it might be their prior political socialization in the home country, having been a leader in the guerrilla in El Salvador might prompt some people to be active in their union and want to change their kids' school and improve it. Another explanation might be that school involvement might enable parents to become involved in their union. So, in order to figure out to understand the causal mechanisms in the correlation I found with survey data, I turned to the in-depth interviews. And I interviewed 20 active union members, 20 inactive union members, and then 30 non-union members who were also immigrants. So these are all Latino immigrants. And what I found was that that union experience stimulated critical civic engagement among some of the Latino immigrants. There were people like those that Kim spoke about who were really shy, who were timid, who had never been involved in anything, and they're forced to speak up, forced to stand up for themselves for the first time at their union. These are people who told me that the union just changed their lives. So these people became active for the first time in their union and translated that into participation in their schools. Then I found some other people who were the go-getters, who liked to get involved in everything, but they reported learning a lot of civic skills. They learned how to mobilize people, they learned how to effectively file grievances and so forth within the union, which then allowed them to exercise greater leadership at their children's schools. And then in the interviews, I found very little difference between inactive members of the union and then this random sample of parents. And what I did was I gave my students transcripts and I said, okay, yes, is this a union member or not a union member? And for the most part, they couldn't tell the difference. So I know that I wasn't reading into things. So here are some quotes. From parents who had never been active in, had never really been civically or politically engaged before they joined the union. There's one mother, Lucia, who says, I was a very shy person, honestly a very shy person. If I had to speak in public, I would turn red and wouldn't know what to say. Getting involved in the union trainings has helped me lose my fear. I believe that the union has played an important role in my life. I've learned a lot, it has given me confidence, and it has helped me defend myself and speak to other people. Another father said, here at my job, you learn how to defend yourself. This gives you confidence wherever you go. And then this other father had a really funny story. He left El Salvador as a teenager when both the guerrilla and the military were trying to recruit him. And he said, all I wanted to do was play soccer. He didn't want to get involved in the politics. He just wanted to avoid politics. And when he came to the United States, he didn't want to get involved in anything either. He just wanted to do his job. He wanted to get paid and so forth. He just hated politics. But then in one situation, he didn't get paid for a while. And he complained. He finally went around to complain to the union. And his union rep showed up at his job site. And he thought that the union rep was going to fix everything for him. And when he went up to speak to the supervisor, the union organizer said, you talk. Tell him what you told me. And he said, I just turned red. I turned red, and I know what to say, but then I shared my grievance. And he said, after that experience, I lost my fear. I heard this, I lost my fear a lot. And he said to me, after what I've been going through with the union, going to the school is nothing. And so this father organized other parents at the school site to complain about the lack of discipline, to complain about there being too many subs in his daughter's classroom and so forth. So there are other people who were either really involved in their children's school prior to joining the union, or just seem to be the type of people who might have gotten involved in a school site council, or maybe would have taken the first time to protest, the opportunity to protest against the overcrowding if they were invited. I don't think the union, they would have been involved with or without the union. But these people say that they acquired certain civic skills, certain claims-making repertoires from their union organizing that they would not have gotten anywhere else, or they didn't get anywhere else. So, for example, Maria says, I used to wait for the school to call me for a meeting. Now when I see that something is wrong, I call other people to make sure that there is a meeting. Another father who had come from Guatemala and who got involved in the early Justice for Janitors campaigns, eventually became the shop steward, who's now somewhat of an older father, said, I'm retired from the union, I only go every now and then, whenever they really need me, I'm not at every protest. But what he said to me is, I help other parents at the school resolve their grievances. Or I help other parents resolve their grievances at the school. So I thought it was interesting that he was using union language to talk about addressing issues at his child's school. So he had a special needs child, and he worked with other parents to make sure there was a ramp at the school. When one of the teachers told him that the water at the school might be contaminated with lead, he got really angry and then organized some of the teachers and the parents and complained to the district, and he said, I went to the top. I don't know if that meant the superintendent, but he was very dramatic when he told me the story. In doing the 20 interviews with the inactive parents, most of them had little contact with the union, except for two parents, and one hated the union, he was mad at them, and then another one knew about the union, but she had to take care of her sick mother. So she's like, so for the most part, the inactive union members had very little exposure to, or actually, in some cases, didn't even know what their union was when I interviewed them. I found that some of these parents were very concerned about their children's schools, wanted to support their children, wanted their kids to go to college like most immigrant parents do. And the most active of those parents tended to be compliant parents. They wanted to be invited by the school, by the teacher, the principal, and were happy to volunteer and happy to help the teachers, the principal, in any way they could. And they said things like, Flora was representative of these parents. She said, I've always said that it's important to support the school when it comes to the programs, workshops, or whatever it is that they ask for. It's never a waste of time to be present when it comes to the children. It's time dedicated to them for the children's future. I asked Flora if she had been involved in any, if she had ever complained or had ever really spoken up at the meetings that she went to. And she says, well, when I speak up, I usually tell them that I could help with the bake sale, or, she's volunteering. She's volunteering, which is good. She's not complaining. And she's not much different from a lot of the non-union parents who were very involved in their kids' schools, who were involved in plug-in types of engagement. So Sandra, non-union member, says, I go to the school whenever they ask for my participation. I want the teachers to know that I care about my children, and I tell them to call me whenever they need help with anything. So in summary, I found that active union members are not particularly involved in plug-in forms of involvement. They're not more likely than anybody else to volunteer or go to PTA meetings. But they tend to be more likely to become engaged in the types of activities that offer them the space to be critically engaged. I also found that union participation motivates some immigrant parents to become critically engaged at the school site, while it enhances the leadership capacity of others. And then finally, I found that inactive union members tend to resemble non-union members in their civic participation. So this research makes several contributions to the research on civic engagement. Like others, I show the importance of studying unions and schools as sites for Latino immigrants to become civically engaged. There's less barriers to participation in these organizations, or at least the social movement type unions in schools, than in other types of institutions. The study also tests whether or not and how organizational participation impacts independent civic activity. And so I studied one type of organization, the labor union, but this opens a possibility of exploring other types of organizations and examining the differential impacts that participation in associations shapes independent forms of involvement. I also show that conceptual distinctions must be made between different types of civic engagement, between the plug-in types and the critical forms of engagement. And I also demonstrate unequal patterns of engagement between inactive members and active members, and between those who have no prior civic experience and individuals who have a propensity or a history of prior civic participation. So this research has a couple of implications outside of the study. Importantly, what my findings suggest is that the fight against economic inequality in the workplace can facilitate the fight against educational inequality. And I could talk more about this potential and whether or not and how it exists if people are interested. And then these findings also show that immigrant struggles against inequality in the workplace and at the schools may potentially transmit civic competencies to the children. And so, as we all know, children of working class families tend to be less civically engaged, but maybe not if their parents are active union members. Thank you. And Lisa.
You want to go ahead and run your own Q&A?
Sure.
So we'd like to open it up for questions.
Mm-hmm.
Hi. I'm curious about the plug-in versus
It's critical.
critical. So I want to ask about that and try to push a little in it.
Okay.
It's not a fully formed question yet, but you'll find the question.
Okay.
And it starts from my experience as both.
Give her the question.
What?
Isn't it your job to give her the
Well,
question?
yeah, something like that. I'll try. Anyway, I've been both a PTA president and on site council.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of things that I distinguish them. One is I also teach here. And I would put being on the site council on my annual activity report. But I would never put being on a PTA in my activity report because that's the stuff of mothers, of women. It's lower status. It's not kind of policy making. It's not bureaucratic. And yet these differences at least occurred in my experience. One was that although the PTA had the kind of veneer of bake sales, it was actually more independent and more critical than the site council. It had much higher participation of women, and I noticed that the examples you had were lots of men on the site council side and only women on the other. And it had more working class participants than the site councils. The site councils had a veneer of policy making, but were essentially affirming the decisions of teachers. In addition, there is a whole literature of PTAs as kind of gateways to women's political participation. So, was that a question?
Can I?
I see the. I kind of see the answer. The question I see it. is to talk more about what parents are saying they're doing in the PTA versus the school site council.
And to talk about gender. And
Gender, yes. Okay.
But also, you came up with these terms, plug-in versus critical, something you are kind of
plug-in
trying
I borrowed from
Okay.
Paul Lichterman's work on volunteering.
Because it sounded to me, and you're talking about the differentiation, I think you actually even said this, that she's not complaining.
Mhm.
So to me, it sounded like in some ways the critical means they're saying there's something wrong with the school, whereas the plug-in was we're trying to build up this school. Like we're actually in the classrooms, volunteering our time, working with the kids. And to me, it seemed like another measure you might consider would be how much time are they spending? You know, it's in some ways complaining is not actually being there, present at the school. So.
Okay, so
No, I'm just saying, I'm just trying to listen. So gender, the differentiation,
right.
and
Yeah,
positive
the
versus
easy
negative
one, gender.
framing maybe would be the.
So the easy one is
question
gender.
here.
Mothers are disproportionately likely to participate in the PTA, and there's, even in the random sample, no gender difference in the school site council. Yeah. So, because, men are exercising their leadership. And I think you have a related question, right?
No.
Okay, all right. So what people say is going on in these different types of spaces. So the PTA, the actual survey question was, did you participate in the PTA or other parent organization? Because in Los Angeles, in a lot of these schools, a formal PTA does not exist. So there's different types of parent organizations, sometimes convened by the principal, and it's usually a gateway to volunteering. Lots of moms do this. The school site council, there were people who were not active in their union or from the random sample who participated in the school site council and said things like, I wanted to support the teachers, what the teachers wanted, what the principals wanted. I got a different story from the active union members. I was not happy with the way this was going, and I wanted to make sure that they changed whatever. So the ways in which parents participated in these decision-making bodies differed, whether they were members of the labor union or not, active members of the labor union. In terms of time, I wish I could ask. So in the interview data, I get a sense of how much time people spent. I didn't ask it in the survey. And yes, some people volunteer a lot. And these tended to be non-working moms from the non-union sample. The union moms worked too much. They had sometimes to volunteer to go to a meeting, they lost sleep. And I have these, and I do have data. I wish I had to. How much? One of the questions I asked was, how many hours of sleep do you get?
Yeah.
It was depressing.
Yeah.
Depressing.
Yeah.
4 to 6 hours.
Right.
I think between 4 to 6 hours was the average.
So one of the hypotheses is just that those who are more active in the unions are less active in the schools because they don't have the time to be actively engaged in both.
Right. So, but I didn't find that. What some of the active union members, the people who went to protest and then went to the school site council meeting, told me they slept 2 hours on the day that the school council meeting was held. It was just, it was incredible. Like, there's a lot of health implications.
And they were equally likely to be involved in the PTA and that kind of thing. So that kind
Right. But no, almost, I'm trying to remember if there was anybody who was a persistent volunteer. Maybe 1 or 2, but with the work schedule where you work nights, it's really hard. And sometimes people had a second job.
I have a question. I kind of wanted to hear about, so what is the role of the union? Is it that parents learn some skills and then they're more likely to apply to the schools? Or is it they change their outlook on sort of become more their efficacy?
I wish I had measures of efficacy. So there's 2 things, efficacy and skills. So people learn how to run meetings. Some of these parents told me that they would convene meetings of other parents to have a well planned out meeting with the principal. So they didn't just say, oh, let's go complain. Let's meet, let's talk about it, let's figure out a way to resolve this problem in an effective way. Remember one mother told me, she said, I learned how to communicate better. I learned that it's not good to just go up and yell and complain. You have to do it in a way that's constructive so that you get what you want. So there is some efficacy, some empowerment, but also concrete skills. And this occurs through worksite meetings, through protests, through resolving problems at the worksite yourself. So SCIU, the janitors union, is really invested in training the workers to do things for themselves rather than having the union organizer do things for them. And so that's a difference between unions like SCIU or Unite, HERE, and then other unions that are sometimes called business unions that aim to sometimes do things for their workers rather than have them help themselves. Did that answer your question? Yes.
One thing I was wondering was, in terms of, the ratios of different ethnic groups within the union, do you think that's something that would matter for Latino advocacy? So is that something that you come across at all? So if, for example, it's half African American and half Latino, or a third Latino, African American, white, or, do you think that would matter in terms of advocacy?
Well, so this union was almost all Latino. There was another union that I have some data for that's Filipino, African American, Latino, white, and there's some evidence that some of the same findings, where people learn these skills, whether they're Black or Asian, and they apply them to their children's school. I don't have the same sample size and same number of interviews, but I do have evidence that this translates to other groups.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that some of the SCIU locals have done well is provide translation, and also have made it an effort to make sure that there's multiracial organizing efforts when their memberships are multiracial. I'm not saying all of them do it, but there are some that are very conscious about making sure that all groups are well represented in organizing efforts. And that makes a difference, I think. I might be wrong.
I'm wondering about the people who had prior activist experience or had brought a different ideology with them when they came to the U.S. And did the way that they participated in the schools, did it differ from the people who were the shy, intimidated, whatever? I guess what I'm trying to figure out is maybe they had the same sense of the problems with inequality or whatever, but did they enact that in different ways? Because because we know all of those stories about the Justice for Janitors, and lots of people who were active in that had actually were already radical before they arrived. Yeah.
That is true of the older cohort of the Justice for Janitors. So a lot of the people I interviewed were children during the guerrilla, or during the wars in El Salvador and Guatemala. So they hadn't necessarily participated themselves. There were 2 dads that I interviewed with prior political experience in their home country out of 40. One of them had just arrived 2 years earlier, and he rose in the ranks of the union because he came in, he was a member of the FMLN, very political. The union just loved him. He was out there leading the marches, but he wasn't involved in his kid's school. And his child, he was kind of new to the country with his kid. He just came. So he wasn't involved yet, at least not yet. I predict that in the future he'll be a leader. Another person was a member of a union, he was a union member in Mexico City, and he said, compared to the janitors here, my union was lame. We didn't, we weren't really trying to change anything. So I think I met some of these older people who had these stories from El Salvador and Guatemala, but they weren't the parents. Their kids were growing up.
Kind of building on some of these questions, and if we sort of take a step back there, I'm wondering if union membership is sort of an entree to engagement in other unions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, perhaps it's important to understand what the predictors of union membership are in the first place, right? So I'm interested, for example, in a separate organization, infant hometown associations, and how that correlates with other involvement in other arenas. And oftentimes that's also measured as a dichotomy. It's in most analyses used as a predictor. Does HTA membership impact involvement in other U.S. organizations? Well, what explains involvement in these organizations to begin with? If that's sort of a mechanism or training grounds for people to become involved sort of across the board, what are the obstacles in participation?
So some other people have looked at who is a member, predictors of union membership, and usually immigrants tend to be in non-union jobs. Union jobs. But those that are, if they're in some of these more social movement unions, they have opportunities for engagement. Now, among union members who tends to get involved, there's been a little work on, to what extent, does being invited to participate, does that predict participation? If the union comes to your work site, does that predict participation? Because depending on the industry and your union, you will or will not get exposure to what your union does. Because in some unions, you just pay your dues and that's it. You never get invited to anything. In others, you do. I don't know if that answers your question.
I actually had a related question in the sense of, because at least the way you framed it, you're talking about large buildings, small buildings, it's kind of an opportunity structure argument that those that have the opportunity to hear from their representative work. So do you have any sense of, among the folks you talked to, were the ones that were active the ones that got asked?
Yeah, and they were most of them worked in large buildings or had done so in the past. So they were the ones that recruited, whether they wanted to or not, to go to the protest.
And because in your slide, I seem to remember you had labor participation as your dependent, right? In your analysis.
It was independent.
I thought it was listed as dependent. That's what I was going to ask you about.
There was one where I predicted union participation, and I found that if you work at night, you're 2 point. Right. So being a nighttime worker was
getting.
Right, and I would have liked to control for whether you were invited or whether you worked in a large building or small building, but I didn't have that measure.
Right. Because I'm just thinking about, like, if we think about future work, how can we differentiate, like, unpacking union membership and analysis in order to kind of take into consideration the different types of unions, right, without ending up with 16 dummy variables. Right. At least because I do think it's such a blunt instrument to make of the week. I think your work really speaks to why you have to know something about the unions these folks are involved in order to determine whether it has an, and at least none of the stuff, imply side, correct me Adrian if I'm wrong, right, we don't unpack it at all, right, it's just another organization.
Right. And those variables will often exist, in a lot of the publicly available data.
Right.
Well, especially because these unions, some parts of the unions do have these kind of practices, and other parts of the very same union do not.
Right.
Right?
Exactly. So even the locals matter, and the leadership in the locals, and then the demographic makeup. Complicated.
I have another question. But this time I have a question.
Okay.
You talked a little bit about whether the arrow went in the other direction. And I want to see is it possible to extend that arrow? And my question is, did you ask, or is there any evidence whether anything kids actually learn in school or experience affects parental activism in either school or union? That is, does civic education in schools matter?
For parents rather than for
parents.
I didn't
We should do that study.
You could do
kids
that
voting.
Yeah. So So I'm working on another youth study, and in that study we're asking kids, are you more involved in your community and in politics than your parents, and why do you say that? And if they're involved, we ask them if their involvement affects their parents, if they try to influence their parents. But it's not.
But you don't know.
I don't know about this. Yeah, in this study.
Did you say that you also did similar analyses in the other organizational settings, the church and community?
Community. So I surveyed members of one community organization, and then did interviews with leaders of others.
And did you find similar patterns, or were they more the plug-in?
Well, so it depended on the community organization. So that's the short answer, depending on what the community organization.
That makes sense.
So the organizations that did organizing and leadership development, we saw critical forms of.
Just to piggyback off her question, I was wondering when you're comparing the link between union engagement in schools and then churches in schools, if you look at ideology, like if maybe some kind of Marxist ideology matters more than a religious ideology, or vice versa.
Yeah, I didn't look at that.
Okay.
And and I didn't look closely at churches. There's only a question, like a survey question about religious involvement.
Oh, yeah. Well, first, I mean, thanks a lot for this fascinating study. It's, I don't know, it's rare to see both sort of rigorous predictors and mechanisms in the same exact talk. So, it's great. You focused on this, understandably, on this very specific subgroup of Latino, immigrant, working class, and union jobs people in LA.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a great strategic case. I'm wondering how much of this you think has to do with immigration. In other words, if we were talking about people of an ethnic minority in working class union jobs in a large urban center, who are not immigrants, what would union participation have this effect, or not?
Okay, so when I did this comparison sample, I found in this 505-person survey, 65 people were union members, randomly selected. So I looked at if they said they were a union member, I asked them what they were. So got a couple of Teamsters, a couple of teacher union members, nurses, and I can't remember what, IBEW workers. And so the coefficients here show that being an active member of whatever other union is correlated with greater likelihood of participating in decision making and in school improvement. This is a correlation that is not statistically significant. My sample size is really small.